Hi and welcome to Lois and Morgana Davidson Art. Today I'm going to be painting this evening scene, sunset on a beach with a horse and rider and distant cliffs, using a limited palette, trying to keep it nice and simple and nice and fresh. I'm using a photograph that I found on Pixabay, and I shall leave a reference to that in the description below, along with a bit more information and the materials that I'm using. So today I'm going to be using Millford cold pressed paper. It's taped to my board with ordinary decorators masking tape. Here's the photograph that I'm using. I'm simplifying it quite substantially. I decided not to include the boat, but just the horse and the rider. I think I'm going to struggle to get the horse right anyway, because I'm not really used to painting animals like this, but we'll give it a go. So here's my board. It's at a very slight angle, only about sort of 10-15 degrees. And as I say, my Millford paper is taped to my board with ordinary decorators masking tape. And I'm going to paint this scene to start with wet in wet to get some nice soft sort of sunset colours into the sky and into the beach. My paper is quarter imperial size, which is 11 inches by 15 inches or 28 centimetres by 38 centimetres. And I'm using a large flat wash brush. It's a Princeton Aqua Elite modeler brush, 1.5 inches. It's synthetic, but you can use any wash brush to wet your page. Now I'm moving on to another synthetic brush. This time it's an Escoda Ultimo, and it's a size 18. And this is mixtures of raw sienna and burnt sienna. And there's a little bit of burnt umber added to it to darken it up in places. And I'm going to bring it down across the sky, just changing up the colours slightly. That's with a stronger mix of burnt sienna across the top to try and keep it nice and sort of bright high up. And then I want to graduate the wash subtly as it comes down to get it lighter and lighter. And then come down and put the same colours across the sea. I'm using these horizontal brush strokes. This helps to keep the orientation of the wash nice and flat and nice and even. As it dries and diffuses, all these various subtle hues and changes in hue and tone will just softly diffuse. There's a slightly darker line that I've just introduced, and that will eventually become our horizon line and a distant headland. Continuing down the page, now bringing in more burnt umber into it to establish the darker tones of the beach. So my graduated wash is going to be changing in colour, as you can see, with the lovely rich sunset glow across the top. A little bit of opera rose just to brighten it up across the top as well. Not too much, but just enough to give it that little bit of glow. And then as we come down, it becomes lighter and lighter across the middle section of the painting, and then it'll get darker again and browner, warmer, as I introduce the beach and the shadows. Painting wet in wet, everything is just softening back and diffusing, and it's just giving me this lovely sort of these soft transitions between the hues and the tones as I get everything into place. Just going in again with that, using the tip of the brush and carefully putting across that slightly darker line for the horizon, and then putting in the sort of a basic underlayer for the cliffs and the trees in the distance. So now I'm going to lift out a bit more light across the middle of the beach area across the sort of wet sand in the distance. This is using a clean, damp mop brush, and this is my size, I think it's a 12 Escoda Ultimo brush. And it's just lifting out a little bit of paint that will soften back, but it'll keep that area lighter so that when I paint in my horse and rider, I should be able to position part of their body over that light, and it should really help the silhouette of the horse and rider to stand out. Everything's almost, it's still damp, but it's almost to the point where I need to stop. Otherwise I'll be in danger of getting marks and cauliflowers, but I'm just going to introduce a few more darks. So I'm using rich, fairly dry paint, or richer, and using the tip of the brush and just getting in enough dark, but not too dark, for a nice sort of blurry headland, and then some stronger darks into the foreground for the beach. A few little touches of dark that will soften and diffuse into the midground, but I'm mostly focusing on getting some really nice darker tones in the foreground. And then warming up parts of that dark with a bit of extra burnt sienna added to that darker brown, just to give me a bit of variation in those darker hues. And now I need to leave it to dry completely, and then once it's dry, I'm going to come back and have a go at painting the horse. So it's all nice and dry. I'm afraid the light in my studio is washing things out a little bit. It's a little bit brighter than this. But now I'm going to focus on looking at the horse. The horse and the rider is in silhouette. So basically, the way to paint this, the way to tackle a difficult shape like this, is to literally try and forget that it's a horse and rider, and just try and paint exactly the size of shape and marks that I actually see. So that's what I'm going to be focusing on doing, is trying to copy the shape. For this, I'm going to use a size, I think it's a size 14 Escoda Perla synthetic round brush. It's got a really nice point and it holds quite a bit of paint, so I can get some fairly fine lines in it, but get good coverage too. So I'm being brave and I'm trying to paint exactly the shapes that I see, starting from the horse's back and back legs, and I'm trying to focus on just getting that shape that I see in the photograph, because the photograph is in silhouette. So in theory, if I can duplicate that simply on the page, then I should actually have a horse and rider that looks reasonably convincing without painting any detail. So I'm just focusing on that dark shape. Of course, I'm painting wet paint onto a dry painting, so if I want to soften anything, like where the horse's hooves meet the sand, I'm just sort of going to smudge it very lightly with my finger, trying to get the angle of those lines that represent the legs as much like the photograph as possible, because then that should give me the feeling of movement and hopefully get that very unique sort of look of horse's legs. Now I'm copying the shape of where the rider is sitting on the horse's back. Sort of leaving a little gap where the saddle is just catching the light in the photograph, and that helps me to define the shape of the rider's leg as it comes over the back of the horse and then sort of hangs down into the stirrup. But of course, I'm trying not to paint any of these details. I'm trying just to focus on trying to imitate the shape that I see in the photograph. I know it looks a little bit strange at the moment, but if you practice this kind of thing, practice painting animals, people, all sorts of things like this in your sketchbook, then you will find that you develop a sort of reasonable understanding of how foreshortening works in terms of painting figures and animals, and it can be reasonably effective. But it does take a bit of practice, and it takes some confidence as well, and that's why practice is useful, because it can build confidence. Just put in a tiny head, and I've left a little gap, if you can see, between the head and the shoulders, and for some reason I've learnt that that can be effective if you're painting these sort of silhouettes of figures. It can be more effective than actually joining things on there for giving the impression of that figure. So now painting in the tail, and hopefully that tail detail should now give the viewer enough information to start to begin to see that horse shape starting to look fairly realistic. You can already see that the back legs of the horse have started to sort of lighten up, so I'll have to go over those and darken it all up a little bit later. But I'm just focusing on trying to get the overall shape in with all the legs, and that little hint of a little bit of the horse's head that you can sort of see just below the rider's body and arms. I think we're nearly there now with the horse, and I think it just about looks okay. Just before all the paint dries, I'm going to take a paper towel or a tissue and gently dab out just on the light side on the right of the figure, and that just gives me a little bit more form and shape. And then when I go back in and sort of darken up around some of those lighter areas, then I shall be left with a fairly convincing horse and rider. And now I can start working on getting a little bit of shadow into the beach below where the horse and rider are. And I'm trying to use these kind of horizontal brush strokes just to get these darker hues in, sort of so that I get the sweep of the beach in the foreground, and we create a little bit of detail, but without painting detail. So we're creating sort of suggestions of detail, something and nothing, as I like to call it, really, because hopefully the viewer will see this surface in the foreground as sort of a stony, pebbly beach. And we're going to kind of increase this illusion in a moment with a sprinkle of sea salt, which then will work on the damp paint and just create these little tiny patterns and textures, which will then give us that sort of beach texture without us having to paint it. I can then change up to a 3/4 inch synthetic flat brush. This one's a Cotman one-stroke brush. I'm using just the tips of the brush and get some finer horizontal lines, and those finer lines will help to push the foreground forwards and the midground a little bit further back. And now back in with some slightly darker marks here and there, just to maybe define that horse's head a bit more. Just a couple of sort of vague suggestions of ears, just sticking out from behind the rider's body, and then darkening up a few areas just to give that sort of 3D-ness. Even though it's in silhouette, I'm just focusing a little bit on having some subtle shadows in there that will add to the form and shape of the horse and rider. So using my palette knife now to scratch through that rich dark paint, and that gives me some real strong darks around highlights that I'm scraping back to by moving that damp paint around. I'm still keeping it very much horizontally oriented and then going back in with a few more darks around those marks, so that I am still building up texture but also building up a little bit of tone and having some areas where the subtle sunset is picking up a few light highlights on the beach. And now I'm going to take some sea salt. It's just ordinary table salt, quite finely ground, and I'm going to sprinkle it into the foreground below the horse all the way along into the damp paint. And what happens is the salt sort of pushes the paint away, and so it leaves some little tiny patterns and textures across that area, and that should hopefully just give me my beach. Now I'm going to go and have a cup of coffee, leave the salt to work its magic, and come back when it's completely dry. So it's all nice and dry. I've brushed any remaining salt off of the painting, but most of it gets dissolved during this process. But you do need to use a stiff dry brush and remove any excess. Just a little bit of shadow, I think, underneath, between some of the salt effects, just underneath the horse. Just using the 3/4 inch flat brush again, the tips of the brush, and using these horizontal brush strokes. It's worth mentioning that the directionality of your brushwork is really important when you're painting a flat surface. Just always try and follow the direction of the land that you're painting with the direction of your brushwork, and it helps to give that sort of convincing effect. Now I've mixed up a slightly paler mixture of my dark, and using my Escoda Perla round brush, I'm just going to firm up the headland a little bit and paint in the suggestion of some trees on the top. So I just want to get the look of this little cliff just disappearing off into the distance. So I'm keeping the colours fairly pale. There's a little bit of tone going in there, but nowhere near as much tone as we've got on the horse and the beach. And of course it will all lighten back as it dries. But I'm sort of softening back, losing some edges here and there. So that's just the suggestion of some tree canopies. Again, using just a damp brush to pull the paint and move it around and to soften it back in places. So as I say, I'm losing some of the edges there. And then using just the tip of the brush, a couple of suggestions of tree trunks, and of course they will lighten back even more, but it still will give me that illusion of that spit of land that the rider is aiming for. Darkening up just where it meets the sea. Just dropping a little bit more paint, wet in wet, slightly darker, into the canopies of the trees and some of the rocks. But I think that's okay. That gives me the impression that I want, without sort of making it too dark, detailed or distracting. So I think I'm reasonably pleased with it. It might need a little bit of work on the beach still, but I'm going to remove the tape and peel it off of the painting and have a look and see how it looks. With a clean white border, it makes it a bit easier to sort of look at it with fresh eyes, to sort of distance yourself from it and see whether it's balanced, whether it looks okay, or whether it needs just a few finishing touches. And I think all I need to do is just to sort of draw attention to the focal point of the horse and rider is using a clean damp brush. I'm going to lift out just a few highlights below the horse on the beach, just subtly by using a clean damp brush and then just dabbing out across where I have wet the page and just get a few of these little highlights. And I think I'm happy with that. And here's the finished painting. It was quite interesting to sort of go out of my comfort zone and sort of take a risk of trying to paint this foreshortened horse and rider. But I'm glad I did, because it's really built my confidence for painting animals and figures. And that is not actually painting a horse as such or a rider as such, but painting the shapes that I see, just a simple shape, and trying to duplicate the shape from the photograph. And that's what gives me the foreshortened effect of the horse and the rider. So I hope that was helpful. I hope you'll practice something like this. I'll certainly be practicing more animals and figures so that I can include them more often in my tutorials, and it can be a really nice sort of thing to practice and to build your confidence with. So thank you so much for watching. Please leave us a like and subscribe to our channel if you haven't already, because it really helps with our reach. And last but certainly not least, thank you so much to everyone that supports us on Patreon. We really do appreciate you. If you want to follow Morgana on Patreon, please follow the link above. And likewise, if you'd like to support me there, then please follow the link. So I hope you have a lovely week. I'll see you again soon. Take care and happy painting. Bye.